to Safe Inside, brought to you by TheraTribe. I'm Jeremy Loomis, and these are my conversations with Sandra Fields, an LPC and certified clinical trauma treatment provider with over 35 years' experience helping people who have been through trauma. Welcome back to Safe Inside. This podcast is brought to you by TheraTribe. I'm Jeremy.
And I'm Sandy.
And we started our conversation about ACEs, that's adverse childhood experiences, last time. This time we want to talk more about the risk factors associated with adverse childhood experiences. If you've had several ACEs, some of the health complications that maybe you've experienced. And we're also going to get into, some of the hope that's there, maybe how you could decrease the intensity of your depression if that was one of your outcomes, and other things having to do with resiliency and recovery. So there's going to be some heavy statistics, but also some hope attached to that. So Sandy, why don't you lead us into that?
I will. Actually, we always have hope. So sometimes if you hear all of this statistics and you hear the overwhelming data, it can feel pretty heavy, like you said, Jeremy. However, what we also offer is some hope. And if you don't feel that hope, know that we're holding it here for you, and we'll be glad to hand it to you whenever you're ready. So we're going to try to keep that hope in sight as we go through this. If you haven't already listened to the ACE part 1, please go back and listen to that. That will make more sense as we get going into part 2 here. As we were talking about in our previous episode, adverse childhood experiences do impact a great number of people in the United States. At least half of the people in the United States have experienced at least one adverse childhood experience. Knowing that, we're going to talk here in a little bit about particular chronic health illnesses that crop up when you have experienced ACEs. But before we get there, I would like to first start out talking about some of the behaviors that come out of having adverse childhood experiences that have an adverse impact on our health. If you have had specific ACEs, you are more likely to engage in these particular risky behaviors, I guess. Health risk behaviors is probably the way I'd like to say that. You're more likely to smoke. You're more likely to be obese, and not just a little obese, but like severely obese. You're more likely to have depression, more likely to attempt suicide, more likely to have problems with alcoholism or drug addiction, inactivity, because you might be sitting around, not doing as much as you should. I hear a lot of my clients who have experienced chronic PTSD will say, I just can't get motivated to get out of bed. I really want to do these things, but I just can't seem to make myself do them. I just can't see myself following through with things. I just can't make myself move. And that can be a definite trauma response, which can impact your health as years go on. IV drug use is higher in people with higher ACEs. Having 50 or more sexual partners is very high in people who have been sexually abused specifically. And I want to stop for a moment and talk about an issue in our society that I hear quite a bit. I hear words like slut and things like that, hoe, kind of thrown around a lot, especially around young people. And I'm going to say, if I see a teenager who's 15, 16 years old, who is having a lot of sexual partners, my first response is not to slut shame this child. My first response is, I wonder who sexually abused her, or I wonder who sexually abused him, because promiscuity and having a lot of sexual partners is a direct response to having been sexually abused. So I want to kind of throw that out there to kind of, for those of you who have had a lot of sexual partners due to this, we see you, we hear you, and we honor your experience because we know that you're doing the very best that you can. And those of you who haven't, I want to say slut shaming is never helpful. And so I want to remind you that this is where this kind of behavior can come from. So that's just my plug. Go ahead, Jeremy.
Yeah, yeah, I can appreciate that, and I'll add to it that some of those words I've noticed in recent years, some of those words are used super casually.
Yes.
Like you can see that in a lot of instances they're not even used as an insult. They're just kind of they're just plain used. Uh, and we've had like in a lot of different areas we've had a push to hashtag normalize a lot of things. Um, but I have concerns about these being things that are normalized, because one person might make the case, oh well, it's just the way we talk, you don't understand our generation. But on another hand, if something's happening so often that it makes sense to normalize it, then I have to ask, is this something, you're just kind of trying to soften the reality of what's happened to you by saying, no, this is fine, this is normal. You're the dog in the burning house, you know what I mean? And yeah, I just have to wonder.
Yes. Anytime that we use slurs that are disrespectful to people, normalizing them or not, they're still disrespectful to people. So
And
that's kind of,
sometimes disrespectful to self, because sometimes these are the terms that people are using of themselves.
yes, 100% agree with that. Um, Back to the ACEs, as you probably could figure out, if you have 50 or more partners in your life, sexual partners, the transmission of STDs and STIs go up tremendously, of course. So these are some risk factors that do happen as the ACEs increase. The number of ACEs in a person increases, the more likely they are to engage in one or more of these behaviors that are risky to their health. That said, not everybody who ends up with health issues due to their ACEs has engaged in this behavior, which is kind of interesting. We know that 1 in 6 adults experience 4 or more ACEs, 4 or more adverse childhood experiences in their lifetime. We know that 5 out of 10 leading causes of death in the United States, 5 out of 10, half, 50%, are associated with adverse childhood experiences. We also know, for instance, that if we could prevent ACEs from happening, depression in adults would decrease, well, the number of adults with depression would decrease by about, it's an estimated 44%. Remember that adverse childhood experiences, they impact our lifelong health and our opportunities, by the way. They add up over time. They are what's called dose responsive. So the more frequently that you have them, the more different ACEs that you have, the more intense that these ACEs are, they impact you exponentially each time. And it adds up within your body and in your psyche over time.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
And if you're listening and you're thinking, oh man, I've only got one out of the 10 and I'm still feeling this paralyzed in my life. Well, recognize that one can still throw you for a loop.
Yeah.
Think about someone with a sword coming at you. That's already plenty dangerous. But if you have 4 or 5 people with a sword coming at you, yeah, that's going to be a lot to dodge, or arrows coming at you. Or consider it as like parasites. There's only so much you can carry and still be all right, be able to maintain vital signs in some sort of normative fashion.
You only have so much capacity for anything else, right? So how can you carry the rest of your adult stress if you're already still carrying your adult stress, your childhood stress? How is that
Yeah,
possible, right?
yeah. Oh, goodness. I mean, sometimes the line is drawn to make sense of the difference between anxiety and depression. We'll say that anxiety is future focused in a way that I might say that is really borrowing time, and depression being past focused. And no matter which of those things you find yourself stuck in, they steal your capacity to be the only thing you can be.
Right.
Um, we talk about mindfulness because that is a way of being a being. And if you can't live in the present, then you're already starting to fracture and dissociate, I would argue, losing your capacity to be here now.
Yeah. Yeah. Trauma does that. It takes away that capacity to be in the here and now. Because until you resolve that trauma, until you've worked through it, you are perpetually stuck physically and mentally and emotionally in the moment of that trauma, whether you realize it or not. So, okay, I'm going to take it back to the health conditions because I don't want us to lose track, but we could very easily go down that path because trauma is so all encompassing of your life. For the health conditions, there are several health conditions that are directly correlated to the number of ACEs that you have experienced in your life. As you become an adult, and as you become an older adult, as I am at that point, these things show up in your life as you go along. They look like depressive disorder, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. They estimate that about 27% of people in the United States that experience COPD have it directly correlated to their childhood adverse experiences. Asthma. If you want to know that statistic, 24% of people, adults who have asthma in later life, and this is asthma that normally comes on when you're about 50 or older, and it can continue to worsen and become more severe. About 24% of people with that asthma, it's directly correlated to adverse childhood experiences. Kidney disease, strokes, coronary heart disease, cancer, diabetes, overweight or obesity. These are health conditions that can be directly correlated to the number of adverse childhood experiences. I feel like that's very overwhelming. We see a lot of ads today on TV and on social media about all of these medications that we need and all of these things, and it's harder and harder to get in to see your doctor. Most of my clients trying to get into a primary doctor, they book months out sometimes or weeks out. I make my visits to my primary care physician, I make them yearly. I literally make them a year in advance to make sure that I can get my appointment because they're so overwhelmed with people suffering from health issues. And we could really decrease the amount of that tremendously if we could work to prevent the ACEs. And also for those that aren't prevented, if we could also bolster our mental health systems so that more therapists were trained in trauma work and more people had access to trauma treatment. I went through the health risk behaviors and the health conditions, but there's also some socioeconomic challenges. The higher your ACEs are, there are more socioeconomic challenges. And part of that is due, Jeremy, to what we were just talking about, that capacity to be able to be in the here and now. And so unemployment is much higher for people with higher ACE score. People with higher ACE score are more likely to not finish high school. And people with a higher ACE score are more likely to have no health insurance, which means they are less likely then to be able to have the access to treatment that would help them move forward. We know that, as we talked about in our previous episode, that females and minorities and marginalized people are more likely they are at greater risk of experiencing 4 or more ACEs in their lifetime. If you have 6 or more ACEs, your lifespan is 20 years less projected than someone with no ACEs. Now we can mitigate
20 years.
20 years less on average without treatment, without mitigation. It's 20 years less than someone with no ACEs. That's a significant difference within that. If you have 6 or more ACEs, if you have 4 or more ACEs, you are 12 times more likely to attempt suicide than someone with no ACEs. If you have 6 or more ACEs, here's that number 20 again, you are 20 times more likely to attempt suicide in your lifetime than someone without any ACEs. This correlation between childhood experiences, these adverse childhood experiences, and problems in adult life are overwhelmingly, it impacts every piece of people's lives. And when we want to help people, to me, it seems like that would be a really good place to start.
Yeah. Oh my. So, I mean, the old adage, I don't know if the kids will be familiar with this one, but an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. It's like that. Yeah, it's like, of course. But at the same time, I think a lot of us are more used to responding to things as they happen, and to have the buy-in to take steps of prevention. This thing has to become real enough to you for you to see, okay, this is worth protecting against. Like a squirrel's going to hoard nuts away for the winter, it has to be real to you what's coming.
It really does. It really does. And those of us who are in this field, it's important that we advocate for some help with these ACEs. If you are a healthcare provider, and that includes physicians and nurses and all of these things, we, including you all, we can anticipate and recognize these current risks for ACEs. And maybe we could be giving all of our clients and patients an ACE questionnaire. They're free online. I'm going to actually read one out to you here in just a moment. We can
include a link in the show notes to one that you all can follow and try for yourselves.
Absolutely. And as healthcare providers, as we screen for this in both children and adults, we then can refer our patients and our clients to places, services that we know can do trauma treatment. We can also link adults to family-centered treatment, by the way, that includes substance abuse treatment, parenting interventions. All of these things are necessary. If you're not a healthcare provider, but you are an employer, you can do some things too. In your workplace, you can adopt and support family-friendly policies, trauma-informed organizational models. You can do things such as paid family leave, flexible work schedules. Things like that can be tremendously helpful in retaining your employees for a longer time. States and communities. So if you're not an employer, or if you are an employer and a healthcare provider, you can still do these too. States and communities can do a lot of things too. We can improve access to high quality childcare by expanding eligibility, activities offered, family involvement. We can look to help change those things. We can use effective social economic supports that address financial hardship and other conditions that put family at risk for ACEs. We can enhance connections to caring adults. We can volunteer for places like Big Brothers, Big Sisters. We can help in those ways. We know that the difference that one truly invested adult in a child can make a tremendous difference in that child developing resiliency. It just sometimes just takes one truly invested child who is head over heels about that child, who will advocate for that child. It doesn't have to be a parent. It can be a teacher. It can be a neighbor. It can be someone at church. It can be a mentor at one of those volunteer agencies such as Big Brothers Big Sisters, which I absolutely love. It can be any of those people. Takes one, can make a huge difference, by the way. We can all recognize the challenges that ACEs make families face, and we can offer support and encouragement. We can do that by not using slurs, for one, not looking at people and going, why can't they just get their lives together? Well, because they're carrying all of this trauma, they can't do it yet. Maybe we can help support community programs and policies that provide these safe and healthy conditions for children and for families to help prevent all of this. We can do that at the voting booth. We can do that, in our volunteering. We can do that in our donations. We can do that in all of these things, making sure that our organizations that we're a part of offer it in a trauma-informed way. So that's one of my obviously my soapboxes, but we together could make a difference in this. And part of it is by having conversations around this and not making this taboo. It's funny because we're going to talk in another episode about the historical movement of trauma and even trauma treatment. But, when we talk about how many people have experienced incest, for instance, and we say that it's highly common that many of these girls that we're seeing, the 1 in 4, some data says 1 in 3 girls are sexually abused before the age of 18. When we say that, many times it's a father or father figure, but we don't say that in our society. And so these girls carry that shame because who are they going to say this to? Who are they going to talk to about this? So maybe we should open up about that. Not saying that we should release the taboo that they shouldn't be doing that. Please, let's not do that. But let's open up the taboo around the conversation, where if a woman says, I was sexually molested by my father, my stepfather, my uncle, my brother, or same thing if a man says, I was molested by my father, my brother. And I'm saying that males as sexual abusers, not that all abusers are males, but it tends to be like 97% sexual abusers tend to be male. There are other instances of females, so I do want to say that. However, if they're having this conversation, please listen. Please don't think, well, they shouldn't be talking about this. Why should they not be talking about this? If they were mugged going down the street, nobody would think twice if they talked about it a lot. We'd be like, oh my gosh, that's a horrible thing to happen to you. I am so sorry that happened to you. But when they say, you know what, my stepfather raped me when I was 8, we don't go, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. That was a horrible thing to happen to you. We go, oh, okay. And inside we're thinking, why are they telling me this? I don't need to know this. Yes, you do. Yes, you do. So that's part of releasing that stigma around receiving trauma treatment.
Yeah.
Obviously, I feel very passionately about this.
Yeah. And it's true that progress on these things happens way too slowly in our society. But it's also true that we've taken a lot of ground in the last 100 years. So yes. consider, gay people being treated as second-class citizens.
Yes.
Women being treated as second-class citizens.
Yes.
Black people being treated as second-class citizens.
Yes.
We have to remember the steps that have been taken in human rights and realize, you raise a fuss about something for long enough and eventually people pay attention. So in that sense, I'm very encouraged, especially as we've talked about before, with the younger generation approaching therapy without shame about being in therapy. I would say there are growing pains right now in our society. And that the tide is turning. It's not turning fast enough, but we've got to celebrate the fact that it's turning at all.
Yeah. And frankly, the tide hasn't turned fast enough for any of those groups and other groups that you didn't even mention.
Yeah.
I know that
for
things
sure.
have
by no means was that an exhaustive list.
Yeah, no. But thinking about all of that, it feels like the tide is turning. But I will say that as a member of several of those groups there, honestly, it is not turned fast enough. And we as a society, we can't be complacent. We have to be out there making this happen, changing these things, because people are hurting. People are dying every day because we are not doing this. And that includes all of those people groups that you mentioned, Jeremy, anyone who's marginalized. And we really need to move to a different place. And we can do this. We have the societal value in the United States that we are good people, we protect people, we take care of people. But our actions are not aligning with our words. And when I have clients in therapy sessions where their actions are not aligning with their words, I typically confront them with that and say, hey, I'm wondering about this. I'm wondering, you say this and you say this is a core value. However, your behavior tells me a little bit differently. How can we live more authentically? How do we need to align? Do we need to change our words to match our behavior? Or do we need to change our behavior to match our words? And I think as a society, we need to do that. We need to do that yesterday. 100%. I know I don't give any quarter there. But again, speaking as someone who's in several marginalized groups, I think I'm over here going, yeah, no, it's not fast enough for me. I'll need to get it together. Get it together. Get your treatment.
I'm really looking forward to our episode about trauma and historical perspective. But man, there's so much we could talk about when it comes to the intergenerational stuff, the stuff that's passed down, what reconciliation could even look like.
Yep.
I mean, it's nuanced. I don't know how much we'll get to on our podcast, but it's a deep well.
It is a deep well. Speaking of the deep well, great segue into that. And I know that you didn't intend to, but there is a really good book around ACEs called The Deepest Well by Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris. I love that book. It's written for the lay people, and it talks about ACEs, but then it also talks about how she developed some pediatric clinics in California to help work around this ACEs. And it's a great model as well. But it's also for like lay people, not for healthcare providers, by the way. They use, for the 0 to 5-year-olds, they use child parent psychotherapy, which I am trained in. I'm actually a trainer in that, and love that. It is an attachment model. And then for children from 5 to 18, trauma-focused CBT is what's used there, or trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, which is an evidence-based treatment as well, developed by Tony Marino and Judy Cohen. And Judy and Tony, if you're listening, hi, it's been a while. And then for the 18 and older, of course, there's quite a few different trauma treatments. Typically, I use an amalgam, a lot of different treatment approaches with each client sort of personalized, because everybody's trauma feels very personalized. I've said all of that. I am going to read the ACE questionnaire out loud so that you can hear the questions. However, before I do that, I want to say that 20-year lifespan difference for those of us who have 10 or more ACEs, that can be mitigated. That can be mitigated. It is something that if you undergo trauma treatment, you learn a lot of skills, such as mindfulness, by the way. Yoga is a good one. All of these things that we learn, along with being able to tolerate and experience life in the here and now, all of that helps regulate our system. And it actually does change our neurobiology to a great degree. There are always going to be some things, trauma treatment is not going to take away the trauma. There are always going to be some things that you might struggle with, but your lifespan can increase by the choices that you make. And part of that is an active recovery. So don't let this overwhelm you if you have a lot of ACEs. Feel some hope. There is a lot of things that you can do to change what happened to you as a child. That said, I'm going to read this questionnaire. And like Jeremy said, we'll post a link in our bio or something.
Yeah, and in the show notes for this episode, yeah, we'll post a link to this questionnaire.
Okay, Jeremy obviously takes care of that. I do not. So it's wherever he posts it, that's where it will be. So here's the ACE questionnaire. So the answers are only yes or no, and you add up your score for every yes that you say. That's it. You probably don't have to write it down because most of you can count to 10. So you might just pull it on your fingers, just count them on your fingers. So while you were growing up during your first 18 years of life, 1, did a parent or other adult in the household often or very often swear at you, insult you, put you down, or humiliate you, or act in a way that made you afraid that you might be physically hurt? Simply yes or no. Number 2, did a parent or other adult in the household often or very often push, grab, slap, or throw something at you, or ever hit you so hard that you had marks or were injured? Yes or no. Number 3, did an adult or person at least 5 years older than you ever touch or fondle you or have you touch their body in a sexual way, or attempt or actually have oral, anal, or vaginal intercourse with you? Yes or no. Number 4, did you often or very often feel that no one in your family loved you or thought you were important or special, or your family did not look out for each other, feel close to each other, or support each other? Yes or no. Number 5, did you often or very often feel that you didn't have enough to eat, had to wear dirty clothes, and had no one to protect you, or your parents were too drunk or high to take care of you or take you to the doctor if you needed it? Yes or no. Number 6, were your parents ever separated or divorced? Yes or no. Number 7, was your mother or stepmother or caregiver often or very often pushed, grabbed, slapped, or had something thrown at him, her, they? Or sometimes, often, or very often kicked, bitten, hit with a fist, or hit with something hard? Or ever repeatedly hit at least a few minutes or threatened with a gun or knife? Yes or no. Number 8, did you live with anyone who was a problem drinker or alcoholic or who used street drugs? Yes or no. Number 9, was a household member depressed or mentally ill, or did a household member attempt suicide? Yes or no. Number 10, did a household member go to prison? Yes or no. Now, I know some of you were counting your aces and some of you came out a little bit higher than you anticipated. So I'm going to remind you, there's a lot of things that we can do to mitigate that. You probably already knew, unless you were struggling with neglect, you most likely knew that you had some abuse in your past. So it's time to get some treatment if you're not already under treatment. It's time to go to a therapist and say, hey, I have this many aces. Can you help me? There is definitely hope. I've seen it happen year after year after year as I work with clients. So I know you can find the help that you need. If you can't, reach out. We will help find a referral for you in your area. Do our very best to do that. So don't be afraid to reach out to us. So yeah. So Jeremy, how are you after reading that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about a few things that we discussed over this episode, the previous one and this one. And I don't know if this is what's on most people's minds or not, but just to kind of round it out, I'm thinking, this, in addition to just being a lot to try to wrap your mind around, it may also be overwhelming, not just from the enormity of it, but from like, well, how do all these seemingly different things come from come from, like, have their roots in these ACEs. And it helps me to, this is how my brain works. I think in patterns. So it helps me to find the patterns to kind of make sense of some of these things. You might look at like, oh, well, how's that lead to smoking, all these addictive behaviors? Okay. Oh, so maybe that's why I do that. Maybe it would help to recognize, like, whether on a physical or an emotional level, usually both. Well, where have your experiences left with you with some kind of deficiency? What I'll tend to tell my clients if they're dealing with some sort of addiction, some kind of dependency, is like, okay, this may not be the best way of meeting your needs, but let's pay attention to what need you're trying to meet by going to this thing, because that's probably going to clue you into what you need to be searching for instead. And a lot of times you're going to find that stepping back into relationships, stepping back into community, carving out a bigger space in your life for that is going to be a step in the direction of reintegrating those fractured parts of you. And I'll often describe any sort of addiction as a one-way relationship. We have to live in relationship, but if you feel wounded enough, you may only want to reach for something that has predictable results, because it just can feel like it hurts too much to let another person hurt you again. So think about that when you see all these things that may on the surface seem unrelated. It's like, how do these 6 different health outcomes that I'm experiencing all at once, how do they all have the roots back in these things that either happened to me or that I didn't get in childhood? And then the only thing I would say also about we talked a bit about poverty today.
Yes.
And that probably, if you're in it, you don't need this explained. But, we already know that finances are one of the biggest stressors in a romantic relationship. Sometimes relationships die because of financial stressors. But then there's also, just consider what's happening. Your world is kind of caving in on you. If I just hope that this week's check clears before my next bill draws from my account, because otherwise, how am I going to even do laundry for my kids this week, right? It's like everything that you're having to keep up with. It's not allowed to be long range strategy. You're not really allowed to think too much about the future, because your vision is cluttered by all these close range things coming at you. So that's very real. So don't be too hard on yourself if you're stuck in kind of like poor ways of coping with that, because everyday life is kind of asking a lot of you.
It's asking a lot, especially in 2022. It's asking more now than we've ever asked of, than life has ever asked of us in our lifetimes. It's a hard time on top of carrying your trauma. So, and if you are living in poverty or have lived in poverty, that in itself is an adverse experience. So yeah, we do need to be aware of these things. And those of us who are not in poverty, let's continue to fight to increase access to treatment. I think we talked at one point about the neurobiology of trauma, and this is an offshoot of that. You mentioned, how do you see this impacting that? It's not necessarily the risky behavior, so that certainly does impact the health outcomes. But it is also apparent in people who haven't experienced too many of those risky behaviors. So I want to say that as well. So it is very important for us to focus on the actual cause, which is the trauma, right? I don't usually pull it like you, Jeremy. I don't usually suggest that a client give up a risky behavior, or like smoking or or things like that, even self-harm
Mhm.
sometimes, if that's their only coping skill and that's keeping them alive, I'm like, I'd rather you do that than commit suicide. So
Yeah.
smoke away, and we'll
Right.
give you some treatment, and hopefully you won't need to smoke eventually.
It's a much better that's a much better course of action than to take away their only security blanket.
You know that sometimes I would rather a client cut their arms than to cut their wrists. And I see,
Right.
self-harm is different than suicidal attempts.
Mhm.
It's a different motivation. So not that I'm happy when they do that. I'm going to
Oh, for
clarify
sure.
that,
For sure.
but I'd rather
I mean,
not
we won't downplay the fact that there are instances of that getting out of hand.
Yeah.
But at the same time, we can't assume that it's the same motivation. So even that could take a bit of education, like for parents and whatnot.
Yes. Yeah. Actually, for a lot of healthcare providers as well. But I think we probably said what we need to say about ACEs. I think in our next episode, Jeremy, I think going into epigenetics, which also compound the physical responses to trauma, would be a good place for us to kind of venture for conversation.
Yeah,
Yeah, we picked some heavy
yeah,
topics.
yeah, and that should be fun. And if that sounds too high and lofty, a little reminder: we're not making this to have it be a scholarly podcast.
No.
In fact, to go back to what we said earlier in this episode, I would add, um, if anything, part of the problem is that some of this good research that's coming out in recent decades, in order for it to be practical and useful research, it has to be translated for the common citizen, in order to be very useful for anybody. Because if if the tide is going to be turned by the general population needs to clearly understand what this research is even indicating.
Yeah.
It's who cares if you have $50 words, but epigenetics is a $50 word. So
Yes.
so don't worry, we'll bring this to a pretty digestible level, and you'll be able to see how these things uh, have impacted the generations leading up to you and you.
Mhm.
So join us for our beginning of a discussion on epigenetics next time on Safe Inside.
See you then.